Okay, final video in Unit 3, Cultural Patterns and Processes, and we're talking about religion. Faith is a foundation of culture. This whole unit has been about cultural identity, and religion, of course, can be an expression of your identity in both what you eat, what kind of clothing you wear, how you interact with people around you. All of this is partly with your identity. And religion can sometimes be part of the legal system in a country. Throughout the Islamic world, some countries have legal codes that are based in Islamic law, handed down by the Prophet's teachings in the Quran. And some of this can go really far away from the hearth area of the Islamic faith in the Middle East. So countries like Nigeria and Malaysia have legal systems that are at least in part based on Sharia law. So when you look at religion's constantly changing from a secular, meaning worldly, very less religious, all the way to people that are at the other side of that pendulum swing, where people are going back to the basics of the faith, fundamentalism, and to some degrees even extremism. You can see that language and religion, like any other part of your identity, all of these factors can be changing over time. So we mentioned in the last slide show about language, being something that's harder to change than religion. A lot of the big universalizing, globalizing religions of the world, like Christianity, Islam, even Buddhism, people will readily convert to. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to change their language. So religion is something that there are provisions for people to adopt new beliefs, to give up old beliefs, or to be non-believers. The other thing about religion is that it will affect your landscape, what you see and what you don't see, architectural styles, the places of worship, whether it's churches for Christians, mosques for Muslims, the temples that Jews build will be different from the temples that Buddhists build. The religious education that comes along with it, the parochial school systems, the Jewish schools, the Christian schools, particularly Catholic Christian schools. All of this can affect the landscape. So I mentioned Sharia law, and this map is really good. It shows you the kind of almost like a hearth area in that yellow color. I think it's yellow, it could be green. But this is where the constitution of these countries specifically outlines the Quran as being the source of the legal code for the country. The countries that are in blue are the ones that do not recognize Sharia law. And I really want to point out the ones that have the asterisk. The asterisk are the countries where the Constitution specifically states that the country will be secular, meaning that religion will not be part of the legal system. And of course, in the United States, we have a similar arrangement in the idea of the separation of church and state. It doesn't mean that God is not seen or heard or, observed in places like a courtroom where it might have the Ten Commandments, or it might have "In God We Trust" on the money. It doesn't mean that there's an absence of God, but it does mean that no one single faith will be the state faith or the faith of the state government. So when you have that star there, that asterisk, like example in Turkey, also in Chad, also out in Kyrgyzstan, you can see that those are secular countries. The sources and the distributions, the David Palmer book does a really good job of showing you this in a chart. So as you check out chapter 8 in David Palmer's blue book, definitely look through those pieces of information about where the religions originated from, how they diffused across time and space, and where they are in the world today in terms of the number of adherents or the number of people who practice that faith. You have to be careful. Remember that a lot of our thematic maps are generalized. So the United States is going to show up as being a Christian country, but something like 20% of Americans do not practice Christianity at all. There are millions of Americans who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Buddhist, who are Hindu, or who are not religious at all. So you have to be careful when you see these maps, because they do kind of overgeneralize certain, faiths and faith groups. But it's important that you see these religions. Now, if they say 5 major religions, obviously Judaism is included. If they say 4, they're excluding Judaism because of its size. It is very small. But remember, you don't get Christianity and you don't get Islam if you don't have Judaism. And so therefore, it is usually considered one of the majors. Even if you see four majors, you know that Judaism is only being excluded because of size. So what are these big universalizing faiths? And Christianity is the one that shows up there as that kind of yellow, orange to red kind of a color. And that is because within Christianity, you have the divisions or the sects that are split. Catholics by far make up the most of the Christians, over 1 billion Catholics in the world. Protestant Christians, those that were the original followers of Martin Luther, who protested against the church. That's why they're Protestants. And that is mostly Northern Europe, Germany, but also into England, and then, of course, into the American British colonies. So you'll see a lot of Protestants in the English-speaking world. And then the Eastern Orthodox churches, from Greece through Armenia up into Russia. Most of that is a different kind of Christianity in the sense that it originally broke off from the Catholic Church around 700 years or so after Christianity was formed by the followers of Jesus in the Middle East. You can see Judaism, little tiny sliver there on the west coast, the Eastern Mediterranean, and that is, of course, today Israel. Remember that post-Holocaust there was a big push politically, geopolitically, to create a Jewish state in the Middle East because of the Holocaust in the Nazi area of Europe, Germany, and therefore the creation of the State of Israel comes with U.S. recognition just after the end of World War II. Hinduism, you'll see that India is very, very concentrated there. It is an ethnic faith, not a universalizing faith. You do not convert to Hinduism. You're born that way. It's a faith that believes in reincarnation. The soul is continuing on. And so 95% or so of Hindus in the world are still living in India today. The only time you'll see Hinduism outside of India is generally a story of migration, mostly for economic reasons. Islam is universalizing, and that's kind of the teal gray colors there. Again, the source area in the Middle East with the teachings of Muhammad the Prophet, and it comes across North Africa and up into Central Asia and then out towards Indonesia. Today, Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country in the world by population. Then you see, of course, the Buddhist color there, kind of that darker gray, and you can see that from its hearth area, which was northern India, it moved out of the subcontinent of India, across China, the Koreas, Japan, up into Mongolia, and then, of course, down into Southeast Asia, where it's still very prevalent in places like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. Mrs. Bursler and I may be thinking about that might be a good trip for 2021. So if you look at Africa, you'll notice that below the Sahara, it's incredibly divided. And again, that has everything to do with the fact that a lot of these religions came to Africa as outsiders. And so in Africa, you have a lot of animism, where the tribal people have similar beliefs to what you would see with Native Americans or indigenous people across Latin America. A lot of this is the worship of the physical spirits, the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the wind, the rain, the water, all of these things, and the animals themselves are important to the faith-based, practices of Sub-Saharan Africa. Another place you'll find that a lot is Aboriginal people in Australia and the Maori in New Zealand, across the South Pacific. A lot of this animistic culture is very prevalent in those parts of the world. Other minority religions that you might sometimes see, Japan is predominantly Shinto, but a lot of influence of Buddhism as well. From the Middle East, a religion called Baha'i that originated in the area of modern-day Israel in the 1800s. A lot of these smaller religions are universalizing in character because they're looking for people to believe what they believe. So, speaking of universalizing and ethnic, we kind of talked about the definitions already. If it's widespread, globalizing, and seeking converts, it's universalizing. If you're born into it, if it is a ethnic faith, it's only applicable to that group of people, then we say that that is an ethnic religion. Usually, and this is important for geography, usually an ethnic religion will be concentrated, like Hinduism is. Judaism is not. But remember, that's a story of the diaspora. That's a story of the Holocaust. That's a story of forced migration. And therefore, Judaism can be found all over the world. Usually, a universalizing religion will be widespread all over the world. Buddhism, not so much. But that's because most of the Asian countries did not colonize and imperialize the way European countries did, and therefore Christianity was going to be spread by the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the English that moved all over the New World and even into Asia, Africa, and Australia. And then, of course, remember too that over time in history, religions can sometimes even change their own characters in the sense that Christianity, some versions of Christianity tend to be more evangelical than others. Some parts of the religion can be spreading faster or more conversions. Islam is one that has spread by many methodologies throughout history. It's a big trading religion as Muslim traders across the Indian Ocean brought the faith to India, brought the faith to the east coast of Africa. At the same time, there's conflict within Islam spreading up into Europe. The invasions that came up into Spain from North Africa, the Moors, and they were in Spain for several hundred years, and as well up into the Balkan states. And this is why you see Islam is still very prevalent today in countries like Albania. So when you think about the chart, this kind of shows you percentages of the world who fall into these different faiths. And again, it shows you both universalizing as well as ethnic, and then, of course, the other. And then the other is going to be, again, some of the minority faiths that we talked about. And again, the David Palmer book has a really good section that shows you that as well. When you look at this table, this chart, it shows you this is just the United States. We're a little over 300 million Americans, 250 million are Christians. So by far, Christianity is the biggest. But if you look at kind of this lower right-hand section of the chart, you can see that there's 10% of the United States that's not religious at all. And then again, you also can see that, yes, there are Catholics, yes, there are Protestants, and yes, there are Orthodox Christians, but then you also have a lot of other churches. Sometime look in a phone book and just look up under the letter C, churches, and look how many different churches can be present in a community. All right? So this chart kind of shows you that. Famous essay question. And I won't say too much about this in the slideshow because you are going to see it in class, but take a look at this map. Again, think about the generalizations of the color schemes. It's a choropleth map, so it's only going to show you majorities. Southern Baptist in the deep south, the southeastern United States. A lot of Catholic populations, especially in the northeast and the borderlands of the southwest. You have a strong Lutheran presence up in the upper Midwest, the upper plains. The LDS Church, what used to be known as the Mormon Church, in the mountain west, particularly around Utah. So a lot of really cool things that they might ask you here about patterns and processes, the where and the why there. Some of these other religions that we talked about in the slideshow, as you can read through here, you can see that these are very small, very geographically concentrated into different parts of the world. In fact, when they give you a question on the exam and it's about Shinto, look for the answer that talks about Japan. If they're asking you about Confucianism and Taoism, or Taoism, it can be spelled with a D or a T. We know that that is going to be Chinese philosophies. Sometimes called philosophies rather than religions because there is no deity. And usually the definition of a religion is that you have to have a deity. Shamanism, the medicine man concept that's very prevalent in indigenous populations, especially Native Americans. Animism that we talked about with Africa. All of these are good examples of religions that are not so organized, but that are more handed down in tribal communities and indigenous communities from elders to their younger people. Remember, the best way to keep a cultural system alive and keep that identity going is to teach it to your kids. Some of these other minority faiths, you can look up, for example, Druze. It's a sect of Islam. Jainism that you can find in southern India. I mentioned Baha'i earlier, originated in Iran and then moved across the Middle East. You can find Baha'i in the United States. You can find Baha'i in big cities in Asia. There's a big, beautiful Baha'i temple in Singapore. So sometimes these religions can be the result of syncretism. Remember that something syncs, it blends together. And so Sikhism is a good example of this in northwestern India. This is a religion that they believe in reincarnation, but it's monotheistic. The teachings have been passed down by the gurus from one generation to the next. The city of Amritsar in northern India has the Golden Temple, which is a beautiful, beautiful building on the UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Site. And this is the source area and the area of concentration for the Sikh faith in the world today. But you can find people who have migrated from that part of the world to the United States. You can find them in the Boca Town Center Mall. You can find them at Disney World. You can find them anywhere in the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and the Caribbean. And again, it just shows you that religions can sometimes be present because of relocation diffusion, not necessarily expanding in their size. For example, the Druze, in order to be Druze, you have to marry a Druze, you have to have Druze children together, and that's the only way that that's going to continue. So when you look at these faiths, all right, sometimes they're minor because there are not very many believers, but that doesn't mean that they're any less present on the landscape. Secularism, this is when you have less religiousness. This is very much something that happens in the United States. And, especially when you look at churches on Christmas and Easter and you can't find a place to park, but the other 50 Sundays of the year, it doesn't seem like there's very many people there. Sometimes you go even more extreme to this and you get to what we say agnostic or atheist, and that is the absence of belief. But we've really seen the world change from governments that were very religious hundreds of years ago to governments that are not very religious today. And this is, present again in the educational system, in the public schools. It's visible when you see, the cultural landscape. Religion is becoming less and less prevalent as people are becoming more and more secularized. So this map or this chart was basically a question of, do you believe in God? And a lot of times income is a big part of this. Countries where people are wealthier, the belief in God kind of goes down somewhat. Countries that are poorer, you see people are more faithful. And that's something that is a generalization across time and space. In conclusion, just like language, religion can bring people together or it can drive them apart. We have both interfaith and intrafaith boundaries that sometimes can spark political conflicts. We'll talk about that in Unit 4, where land is the real issue that causes these conflicts. We probably should mention as well fundamentalism and extremism, which can lead to terrorism. Remember that this is found in all faiths. It's not just one part of the world. It's not just one religion. It's not just one nationality group. You can find these extreme beliefs in all of the faithful people of the world. But most people, of course, are somewhere in the middle, neither secular nor fundamental or extreme, but moderate. And as that trend continues geographically, it's important to see those patterns and processes.